Hello, Nave.
Hi, how are you? So good to see you again, Chris.
I'm very well. I'm very well. Interestingly enough, you were one of the first people I interviewed for this podcast when it was launched at the beginning of last year. And obviously, back then we talked about your book, Flares Up, by two middle-aged men from England, one across the Atlantic. This one is different because we are promoting another book of yours, but it's your memoir, which I've just read and I really enjoyed. Very interesting revelations in there, which we'll get to in a minute. But before we do that, in case anyone didn't see the last interview, just a short introduction about who you are and your quick journey from to this point.
Sure. Well, the last time we talked, like you said, it was just around the time that we were launching Flares Up. And since then, I had actually written this memoir, Following Sunshine, before Flares Up, believe it or not, earlier on. And it is my story, obviously, growing up in Ireland and my introduction to traveling and volunteer traveling. And also has a year where I took out a year when I was living on Sark, in the island of Sark. I took a year after that was finished and went as a volunteer around the world. And my very last project was to help a solo sailor crew his boat from Florida to the Bahamas. And instead of taking 1 month, it turned into the rest of my life. And we spent years and years on the sailboat. And so Following the Sunshine, it was written first. However, it is now serving as a prequel to Flares Up because after the pandemic, I kind of did another rewrite on the end of it, and I brought us right up to that moment where we took the photograph on the front cover of Flares Up.
Okay, okay. Well, let's start at the beginning then. Like any story. So, well, first of all, why did you decide to write this book? Because we'll get into it in a minute, but there's quite some real, like every moment was very personal, but particular for you, there's some very personal things in there. So, what made you decide to write about it?
You know, it's true. I mean, a lot of people have to dig very deep if they're going to write a memoir. And, you ask yourself, first of all, are you writing it for yourself? Are you writing it just to put your chronology in place for future generations, maybe to read about your life? Or are you writing it to share it with other people? And if you're going to do that, which is what was my plan, is yes, you are laying bare your soul, but you're doing it for the reason that if your experience is anyway similar to anybody else's, you're kind of giving them you're relating to them and saying, okay, I had that experience also. Here's how I dealt with it or coped with it. So from my point of view, really the whole purpose of writing the my story in Following Sunshine is to share the kind of insights that I've learned along the way, things how not to do it, maybe how to do better, that kind of idea. So it's really my attempt to help somebody else out if they have anything similar in mind, and also because it's very much on the lines of volunteering and giving back to the communities, trying to show people what it's like to give back and travel in that manner.
Okay, cool. So again, let's start at the beginning. What was it like for you growing up in Ireland at that time? Because obviously you had the troubles were still going on. There's a lot of politics there. So what was it like for you growing up in Ireland as a young girl?
Well, we were very lucky. I was on the coast in Dublin, on the peninsula of Howth in the town of Sutton, and I was kind of removed from it as a child growing up. So I was aware of it, but I wasn't like in the thick of it in Ireland. So from that point of view, I had a pretty easygoing childhood. Grew up, like I said, across the road from the sea. So the ocean and the sea and sailing and swimming and eventually scuba diving really became my journey into all of the things I've done, I think, in my life.
Okay, cool. So, and obviously that's one theme in the book is that your love of water and your love of sailing. Um, Obviously, with your mum and your dad, like, what was it like the family dynamic in that, especially with your dad, because obviously his name was going as an actor as well. So I was like living under that.
Yeah, my dad was a very well-known actor, and my mother was also an actress. They met on stage, believe it or not, in the National Theatre of Ireland back in the day. And I think about 4 years after that, they got married. The interesting thing for me, and I do think it has had a huge impact on my life and how I kind of created the life I have, is that because they worked freelance as actors, initially on stage, they would probably get cast in a show that might only last for 3 or 4 weeks at a time. And they never really knew for sure or when the next job would come. And watching them navigate that and still raising a family and, paying their mortgage and paying their bills, it taught me a resilience when it gets tough. You just kind of think, find a way. There's got to be another way to look at something. And also embrace variety. Because they never had the same day every day of the week, like, from 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, right throughout the year. So there was a lot of variety in our home. And another expression we used to have in the house was never a dull moment. And there wasn't. It was always something new, and also new and interesting people to meet that maybe were visiting Dublin that my parents invited home. So it was a really way of showing me there's more outside my own front door.
So obviously, for the success of your parents, you talk briefly at the beginning of the book about going on set and experiencing that, but you also, correct me if I'm wrong, weren't you a television director as well for a short while?
That's right. I was working for RTE television. I was freelance, and I was directing a daily show called Live at Three with Derek and Thelma. I did that for about a year or two, and various different documentaries and entertainment kind of shows. So I was with as a freelance, I was with RTE for a period of about 4 or 5 years, I believe. And then I took off after that.
Okay, cool. But before we took off, obviously, and going back to the sailing, you did canoeing, I think, as well. And I think you helped on one of your father's films with that as well. Just tell us a little
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Back in 1985, my dad was cast in a movie called The Mission with Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons. And it was directed by Roland Joffe, produced by David Putnam. And it was shot entirely on location in South America, part of it in the jungles of Colombia, and the other part down at the Iguazu waterfalls in Argentina. And I just finished up studying under Sir Peter Hall at the National Theatre in London as a trainee director, because I had gone into that role in theatre myself initially as a trainee director. And my dad said to me, "Well, are you doing anything at the moment? Do you want to come to South America with me?" And I said, "No, actually, I'm between gigs at the moment. Yeah, I'll be very happy to go." And he wanted, help with his lines and getting everything ready. So I went. And when I got there, the producers realized that I also had a skill set in canoeing and outdoor sports and adventures. And I got a job as a stunt assistant on the stunt team. So it was a magical time. I had a great time doing my job, but also it was a lovely time to hang out with my dad, as two adults. It wasn't the kid and the dad anymore. It was two adults. And I think our respect and appreciation for each other really deepened during those few months that we were away.
Did that spark your love of travel, actually going to that film, going to South America?
I'd always been interested in travel. That started much earlier for me. It was I would think I was 12 at the time. And my dad had taken us and my mom and my sister over to Spain on our first overseas holiday. And I remember it was in February. And you know yourself, in England, it can be a bit dreary and grey and rainy during the winter, same type of weather as in Ireland, right? And we were there in Spain in February, and I was like, wait a minute. People have been holding out on me. There are countries where the sun shines in February and there's blue skies and it's warm. And after that moment, I realized I want to live in warm places. I want to be able to travel and see different places and experience different cultures and foods and everything else like that. So that's really when the travel bug started with me, was back at 12 years of age.
Okay. So all this is going on. You're enjoying life. All this is happening. And then there's a section of the book which is really personal to you, where you talk about the renovation of a house. And let's be in the bush, a lot of abuse happened. Obviously, something like that, it must have been very traumatic for you, especially what happened at a young age. Um, did you tell your family about what happened to you in that regard?
Yeah, just to give a little backstory for everybody on that, what happened was we did have some tradespeople come in to help with the renovation. And I was about 8 years of age at the time, and we were all helping out. And this particular man, I guess looking back, I didn't know at the time he was a pedophile. And so he definitely molested me as a child, and it went on a little bit. Now, my family was unaware of it. And for a year, I never said a word. It's kind of those things where I know I've listened to a lot of people who've kind of experienced even worse than I did. uh, Say it was so shameful. There's something about it, it's wrong, and you think you're the person who's wrong, and so you hide it. And I never told anybody at all. And it wasn't until I was well into my 30s, I think, maybe even hitting 40, when I was already living in America at the time, and you heard more about it on the television, different shows, people would talk about things like that. And at that point, I don't know why, I decided, well, maybe I should tell my family at that point, and I did. My dad had already passed at that point. And even then, I talked about it, but not much. It was kind of like, okay, well, that was it when I was a child. Now they know, and just move on with your life. And it wasn't until much later, literally in the last 8 years, when I was on the sailboat, and I'm sure we'll talk about Gary in a moment. He was the person who really drilled down with me on it, and we examined my whole sort of sense of it and feelings of it. And I had to make a decision whether I would include that in the memoir or not. And I thought, you know what? It was such an isolating experience for me because I experienced it by myself. Maybe there's other people that are going through that or had that experience, and maybe my talking about it and how I dealt with it or didn't deal with it could be helpful for somebody else. So that's why I thought, okay, I'll go for it. One of the things that I was very concerned about at the time, and I said this to the editor, is that I don't want it to become the focal point of the book, because it's not. It's not a book about child molestation or child sexual abuse by, a stranger. And also, I didn't want to people to think it was at the hands of my own family or parents, because it wasn't. This was an outsider. It was the person I knew, but they weren't. They were a stranger to me, but they weren't a stranger to the family, let's say. So that was one of the reasons. And I didn't. The book is not about that per se. It's part of my journey. It's definitely been a part of who I am as a result, but it's not my focus, if you like.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. So all this has happened, and as you alluded to earlier, you decided to start going traveling. When did you decide to start doing that by yourself?
Well, the first time was right after school when I finished my secondary school. And the next point of living, if you like, was, are you going to go to college? Are you going to start a job? Are you going to get into a trade? And at that time, we're talking about the end of the 1970s in Ireland. To me, I thought there wasn't, not everybody was going to college. Like right now, I'm based in America, and it's just a given. People just assume. I mean, if they have the means, they go to college. That's kind of the next step, if you like. And at the time, I thought I had read an essay by Cardinal John Henry Newman in school as part of our English curriculum. And in it, he had said, it was a piece called The Idea of a University. And in it, he said, it's a school of knowledge of every kind, consisting of teachers and learners from every quarter. And it really struck home with me about the concept of a diversity. And I thought, well, at that stage, Ireland was pretty much a fairly homogenous society. Who am I actually going to meet at college? Am I going to get that universal kind of experience? And I thought, no, maybe not. So I checked in with my parents, and they agreed. I went to Paris for the first year and I went to the Sorbonne University to their international class. And I studied French language and literature there. So that was meeting people from all these different countries in my class, really opened up my eyes. And I thought at the end of that, I want to go to all these places where all these people are from, because the one thing we had in common, believe it or not, was French. And French was not our mother tongue, but it was the only way we could all communicate. So they were interesting conversations, quite basic and yet quite profound. It was a really eye-opening experience for me. So that definitely set me on my path for traveling.
Okay, cool. So you went to Paris. studied there. What was your next step after that? Did you go back to Ireland, or did you decide, actually, I want to explore more of this? So you went outside of Europe. What was the next stage?
Believe it or not, the next stage was I did go back to Ireland and I followed my parents' footsteps, if you like, into show business. And I started out in theatre on the bottom rung of the ladder, if you like, making the tea, sweeping the stage as an assistant stage manager. And then I worked my way up through the stage management side and then started to get some small roles like walk on, a couple of lines here and there, small acting roles. And the funny thing is, both my parents were very talented. And whether I had a talent or not, I wasn't really sure, but I was more drawn to behind the scenes, to creating the overall image, if you like. So that's why I started training as a director in theater. And then from there ended up training as a director in television. And ultimately, my plan after the mission, when we were filming the mission, and my ultimate plan was, oh, I'd love to direct like movies as well. So that was kind of my whole behind the scenes creative push, if you like.
So what stopped you from doing that in the end?
That's an excellent question. I'll say a boy. Right around, I think it was 1993. Just prior to that, I had learned how to scuba dive and I became a scuba instructor. And during my year that I was learning how to be an instructor, I met somebody else doing the same thing, and we became boyfriend and girlfriend. And he had a penchant for traveling as well, and he had this idea that we would just travel around the world as scuba instructors. And basically that was it. I kind of like gave up everything about this was about 4 years after my dad died. And one of the things my dad's death had really weighed in on me was that when we die, the items and stuff, I would like things, material items, kind of lose their meaning. Like things that were really important to my dad, physical things, now they were just stuff, that we had to dispose of or sell or give away, etc. So from that moment on, I thought, I want to travel lightly through the world. I don't really want to collect items. I'd like to collect experiences instead. So this idea of taking off for a year and going teaching scuba around the world sounded fantastic to me. So I, again, I was freelancing for RTE television at the time. So I gave them notice. I said, okay, I'm going to be gone in a couple of months. And we took off first on a volunteer project to Belize, because at the time they were running well, let's say a volunteer project looking for divers to come and map out the coral reef. They were trying to put in a marine sanctuary in place because it's the second longest barrier reef system in the world after the one in Australia. So we went for that, and I think we were there about 4 months. And that's where I thought, yes, I want to continue doing this. But I did go back to Ireland and worked some more. So that was kind of how the pattern started. I would take off for a while, work, volunteer or travel, and then come back, work some more, and catch up on finances again, and then take off again. So it was kind of a pattern started then.
Just going back to what you said about things, obviously I'm similar to you in that, apart from reading a lot of books, I'm not the most really materialistic person. But were there anything, both when you're sorting out your dad's possessions and also things you bought yourself, where you thought, actually, this is a bit sentimental, I'd actually like to keep this around in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, you're right. It does. There were some things that when we kind of sold everything and packed up, there was photo albums. You remember the old photo albums that had the glue and the big cellophane on front, those ones. And my mother at the time was very sweet, and she said, "No, you don't have to give all that stuff away." She says, "You can leave them here in my house." So I left photo albums there in her home for many years. Little items like that. It was a bit difficult to give away, and there was one a tiny little jewelry box that my dad had brought home from when he was filming, I want to say the Fourth Protocol. I was in Finland, where they were shooting those scenes. And I wanted to keep that, do you know what I mean? Little items like that. But other than that, mostly I kind of became conscious of keeping stuff. If I haven't used something maybe in 6 months to 12 months, unless it's a seasonal item, like, I don't know, a Christmas decoration, that kind of thing. If I haven't used it, then do I really need it? So I started to thin out a little bit like that. And a lot of my travels were with like rucksacks or backpacks on my back. And obviously you can't carry the kitchen sink with you, you know, you need to keep it down. And I never really wanted more than what I could use at any one time. Although, of course, during my life, you know, I've been in houses, I've been in boats, I've been in, you know, I've kind of swole up and got more stuff and then I've sold it all back down again. So it's kind of a revolving door sometimes.
Yeah. I just thinking actually as you're answering that question, with a lot of people, they may say, well, okay, you might do traveling for a certain while, but then when you get to a certain age, you want to put down roots. But from reading his book and from speaking to you both now and in the last interview, you seem a bit more free spirited than that. You just want to travel around the world and experience as much as you can. Would that be accurate to say?
Yeah, you're pretty spot on. And do you know what's kind of funny is the boat that I ended up crewing on was called Freed Spirit with a D, like past tense, like Freed Spirit. Yes, I do. I've reinvented myself a number of times for want of a better thing to do, but also through circumstances and different places I found myself in. And I've been very, very lucky that I can kind of create home wherever I am. It's almost like wherever I lay my head, that's my home for now, or this is my family for now. These are the people I'm with, and really try and live in the now in that moment. And again, I would put this back to my parents' influence on that concept of variety. I do love variety. I think if it's the same thing for me all the time, I would I don't want to say get bored because I think boredom is something you can totally avoid if you put your mind to it. It's just I feel like I wouldn't be growing. Let's put it that way.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I mean that was definitely one thing that I could relate to, that the lack of materialism and just wanting to travel away. And I think the advantage you had as well compared to anyone else doing it now is, I imagine back then it was relatively cheaper to do it as well. That you could like go away, come back, work, go away. Whereas today, I think it'd be a lot more expensive. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, certainly with the airfares, if you're going to fly anywhere, good Lord, the airfares have seemed to gone through the roof in the last little while, or in the last few years. I don't know if it's before the pandemic had started or during or afterwards as a recovery, if you like, when nobody was flying anywhere. Yeah, I think it was probably less expensive back then. Also, for me, I did a lot of volunteer work, so I wasn't paying for accommodation or food. I was actually working in exchange for food and lodging, if you like, but the paying for airfares to get from A to B. The other thing for me that was interesting was back then I didn't have a cell phone. I had one tiny little flip phone that I would keep for emergency if somebody's trying to get a hold of me. And so I didn't have the GPS. I remember one time I was driving across America from Key Largo up to the Washington State, just you know, on my way towards Alaska. And I had one of these huge maps of America, like just like, you know, the entire country. And it wasn't even a road map. It was one of those ones that showed mountains and valleys, if you like. And that was like before the days of, oh, you don't even look up directions of how to get anywhere before you get in your car. You just wait and you plug the address in and you do what you're told in the car.
Yeah.
So those kind of things, like even to this day, if we're going to go somewhere, yes, I'll put in the address now on the phone, but I also want to look at the map and get a sense of geography, especially if I'm the one driving, because I want to get a feel for, no, that doesn't feel right. I shouldn't turn right here. Because sometimes the GPS can turn, you know, have you drive 3 times around a car park and then turn left, you know. So I like to I love looking at maps, you know, that the first present that after I wanted to travel that I asked my parents for my birthday was an atlas. And
Mm.
you know the way some people like love looking at coffee table books that maybe they're cookbooks or photography books. For me, it's looking at a map and looking at charts. And that, I don't know, it just excites me. Just the possibilities of all the places you can go and who lives there and how do they live.
Yeah, I think the exploring is. I mean, obviously, I've never traveled outside of Europe, but even going to a new town, just doing that and speaking to people and whatnot.
Mm,
And it's really interesting because I interviewed someone previously about technology, and one of the things talked about was sat navs, and I said
mm.
how we're almost too reliant on them, and almost like the day when we had the maps and you had to do it yourself and you had to go and speak to people and whatnot. I'm just wondering, with all your experiences of traveling and doing that, I imagine must have made you very streetwise, very from a very young age.
Yeah, and I didn't know that, but I kind of intuitively knew it. A lot
Mm,
of people had said to me, "Oh, you gotta be careful. You gotta do this. You got," and I thought, "Don't put all those ideas in my head. You're just going to put me in a state of anxiety." And I remember that time when I did do the first time I drove across America by myself, like I said, with only a map I'd taken down off the wall. People in America wanted me to carry a gun. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. A, I'd probably shoot myself by mistake, but I'll be fine. Don't assume that something's going to happen to me. And at that stage, I didn't actually have a cell phone. But what I did was every night when I got off the road, I would call an 800 number. I was working for hotels at the time, and I was able to call in on the 800 reservation line and say, I'm okay, I'm good, I'm good. And I also know that, we talk about intuition and that people say like the hairs go up in the back of your neck and all those kind of things where you just sense this doesn't feel right.
mm,
I think one of the things traveling will do for you is it will push into your brain to listen to those intuitions. And because a lot of people can kind of they feel it, but maybe they then ignore it, or another thing. And it's like it's never one thing. It's like mistakes, like big calamities don't happen with one thing. It's like this part happened, then this thing happened, then this thing, and then suddenly there's a snowball effect. And I think walking confidently in a street or in a town where you don't know where you are, that obviously is the number one goal. I mean, they say to people who, go to New York, don't look up. That's the one thing that'll show that you're a tourist and you don't know where you are, and somebody could rob your pockets or that kind of thing. Or don't stand on a street corner with a map open. Things that just common sense kind of things. And I think that you have to just embrace the idea that you're going to be okay and think positively. And that's not to say bad things don't happen to people who feel confident. I know they do. You do have to rely on your instincts though too, and make decisions. If it doesn't feel right, doesn't feel safe, well, just walk away, take yourself out of the situation
yeah, indeed.
if you
So
can.
going back to you traveling, you went to Belize. What was well? First of all, how did you end up in Belize, and what did you do while there?
So there was a company, I think they're still around, Coral Key Conservation, a UK company actually, who were overseeing this marine sanctuary conservation program in Belize. And so we applied for that, as they were looking for scuba divers. So we went on that. Part of that job was to map out the underwater terrain and we used to dive in teams of four. So one person would map out literally the topography, like what the geography looked like underwater. Another person would document fish, and then one would do corals and sponges and the other ones would do algae and invertebrates. And what we would do then is we would then put that back on a report and send that to the home office. They would then look at that, use satellite imagery and say, okay, if this looks area here, they're saying to us it's mostly brain coral number 5. And I don't know how they did it, some kind of color coding system. And then they look further down the satellite imagery, further down the reef, and they go, okay, well, it looks like maybe there's a whole lot of brain coral down there. And in the end, what they did was they created almost like a set aside, in farming where, okay, this area here is going to be protected. Nobody's allowed fish or dive or boat in this area. Let the reef grow, let the fish, let the marine life be safe and not free from predators, on, on human predators, as opposed to whatever the natural underwater predators were. And I think that's how they set that whole thing up. So that was back in 1993, I believe.
Okay. One of the things, I'm not sure how far after this was, but one of my favorite parts of the book is when you went to, I think it was Tonga, and you would
Oh,
visit there and the people you met. And it just seemed to be another world because that's always a place that's fascinated me in particular, traditions and culture. Maybe because I'm a big rugby fan as well, why
okay.
Tonga has fascinated me. But can you just explain your experiences with that? Because that, in terms of all the books, that was the one where I think, to me, it seemed like you made the most community, where you really did make friends from that trip.
Yeah, I was down in Tonga for, I want to say about 4, maybe 5 months. This was in 2015, and it was a year I had taken out to go around the world in one direction. I started out in London and I went from St. Bart's down to New Zealand and had a job up in Tonga. and it was volunteering. So my job was to help this Australian family who lived in Tonga, to help them tutor their two young teenage children. Now, what they did, the parents, they ran a swim with the whale business in Tonga, and there's like it's one of the few countries where they've done a great job where they actually license certain dive guide individuals within Tonga that are allowed to bring divers out, or yeah, snorkelers really, out to see the whales when they come up from Antarctica to have their young. And my job was to help the children get their assignments in on time to an Australian school system. It was online. That was the plan. It was online. But by the time I got there, they weren't living on the sailboat. They had now eked out a development, if you like. They started with a barn, beach huts on this island called Namuka, which is 6 hours by ferry north of the main island of Tongatapu. And there's a small village there where like 450 people.
Mhm.
And on the west side of the island, they had eked out this, I won't say development, it was a place called Lolafutu. It was very early days. They were still living in tents, like we were in tents at the time. And by the time I got there, the internet was like a day sail away. So we couldn't get their assignments on the online system anymore. So I ended up having to homeschool, which was not, I'm not a teacher. I always explain I'm not a teacher, but they really helped me out with the stuff that was difficult for me. Like maths was never one of my strong suits. But some of the sciences I was okay with, and physical, we did some, PT, that kind of thing, physical education. And one of them was the Tongan language. That was one of their electives. And of course, can you imagine? I was like a week off the boat. I was like, didn't exactly speak Tongan. But what we did was they had learned some words and they had written them on little pieces of cardboard that they made flashcards out of them. So we worked with those for a while. And then finally, when we ran out of words, I went to the local village and to the schoolmaster there. And I said, are the young kids learning Tongan? And he goes, yes. And the older kids were learning English. And I said, well, how about a swap? If I help the older kids learn some English, could you maybe give me a book or some kind of instruction stuff for the younger people? And maybe we could work with that, which we did.
Mhm.
But the main experience for me living in Tonga with this family, the Sheens, amazing family, was that they weren't learning about sustainability. They weren't learning about living organically. Sorry, they weren't learning about it. They were actually living it. They caught the fish. The boy Kai was 15 at the time, and his sister Dior was 13. Kai could run around and catch a wild boar on the run, and then he would, whittle it, what do you call it, a spit, and they would roast it over an open fire. He could, snorkel dive for fish, harpoon a fish. So they were like, if they were making Lord of the Rings again, these two kids could just, they wouldn't have to act, let's say that way. So I learned an awful lot from them. Now, tragically, 2 years after that, Kai was home on a visit to Australia and he was killed in a bike accident. So for such a tight-knit family of four people living in the wild by themselves, it was, can you imagine, devastating. I mean, it still bothers me to this day. In fact, some of the royalties from Following Sunshine will be donated on his behalf into one of the projects they're trying to work on Namuka. And then if that wasn't enough for one family to endure, in January, I want to say it's January of 2022, the volcano that erupted and the tsunami that came afterwards, that washed away everything they had built on the side of Namuka. It was literally washed away. And I remember speaking to, or by chatting with his mother afterwards, and saying, he said it was like as though every memory they had of their son was washed away. And it really puts it into perspective about living in the now and being so grateful for what we have and cherishing every moment, because none of us know how long we have.
Yeah, indeed. And I said that was the most of all. That's my favorite part of the book because like it was the whole community. You learning Tongan. It was interesting because didn't you like collect stones and whatnot and like put them into certain phrases and Is a way to like, learn maths and do that.
Yeah, yes, that was with there was another family up in the islands of Oahu, and I was up there for a week while the Sheens were actually using their boat to they as a part of there was filming Survivor Man with Les Stroud at the time. So I was staying with this other family and the children were younger. So they were actually learning, nine times tables and stuff like that. So what we did was they again had a beach and kind of not yeah, the edge of the jungle, if you like. So we collected stones and sticks and seaweed, and we laid them all out in like shapes of 9 times 5 equals, and there was a way, it was a really kinesthetic way. So you're not in a classroom, but you're learning from the classroom of life and nature all around you, and those were the kind of moments you have to think differently, and how can you embrace the environment you're in now, and you can't just say, oh, well, I don't have a chalk and a blackboard. So when you don't have resources, you get resourceful. And it was
Yeah.
so much fun, so much fun.
So where did you go after Tonga? What was the next destination?
Tonga, I continued my circumnavigation. So after Tonga, I want to say, oh, I took a side trip to Bora Bora, which had been on my like to bucket list number one for years and years and years. And I thought I could never afford, and I didn't have somebody with me that I could enjoy this honeymoon capital of the world. I couldn't find a volunteer project, but I ended up finding a little pension on the main island of Tapi, and I stayed there literally on a budget and ate from food trucks and stuff like that and experienced Bora Bora. I thought I can't be in the South Pacific and not go see it.
Yeah.
So that was wonderful. But from there on, my next project, volunteer project, was up in, I want to say, Palau on and I worked with a hostel there, a lady who ran a hostel, so mostly cleaning and helping out like that. But I got to experience Palau and gorgeous locations. And then all through Asia. And then finally back at the end of a year, I came back to London. I was sort of like, okay, I've literally done my circumnavigation, albeit by plane. And I was at that point, I was going to settle down and say, okay, I'll stop traveling for a little bit. And I was sending out resumes in America and CVs in UK and Ireland. And I was waiting for interviews. And then I was kind of really kept researching all the places in the world I could go. And I found that one project, which was to volunteer for a solo sailor and bring the boat from Florida to the Bahamas for 1 month. I said, okay, I can do that for 1 month.
Just quickly, because we'll touch on that next, but you went to Palau. Was that where your mattress where you slept was in the same place as a classroom?
Oh, good memory. No, that was actually Vietnam. I forgot about that. Yeah, I ended up, I was supposed to be teaching English in Vietnam, and I had been recommended to go to Hanoi to the old quarter by somebody who had traveled there before. They said, you're going to love it. It's so atmospheric. It's really vibrant. And this was somebody in their 20s. And yes, it is. For me, it was like, oh man, the noise. It was cars, horns, and scooters, and beeping, and traffic, and just like it put my nerves on edge. And I thought I'd be okay because I thought I was going to this town by the sea, which would be smaller, like a village, but it wasn't. It was like the third largest town in Vietnam. And the school where I was to teach, they said, oh, it was somewhere to sleep as well. And it turned out it was an air mattress inside one of the classrooms. And I thought, I don't know if I can do a good job here. It just didn't feel right for me. Like, talk about intuition. And yet he did have other volunteers there, so there was other people who could do it. And I just thought, no, this doesn't sit right with me. The whole experience. I'm grumpy already, and I haven't even started. That's not going to be conducive to A, my having a good experience, or B, being the best version of myself for other people around me to have a good experience. So I kind of withdrew from that. Yeah, that was Vietnam.
Oh, so go back. Okay, now Neve, now we get to the point of the book where you meet your husband, and just explain basically how that occurred.
Sure. So I think we were talking originally about my year traveling as a volunteer. And that was after I had been living on Sark and the hotel I was managing closed. So I took that year out and I had done the year traveling around and I was about to settle down. And I saw one more project that I wanted to do, which was to crew for a solo sailor just for 1 month. So I flew to Florida and I met him. And the funny thing is, my family thought, are you insane? You're going to go to sea with somebody you've never met? And what I didn't know at the time was his friends were telling him, you're going to take on somebody you've never met. How do you know she's not a modern day pirate or something is going to take your boat while you're like 12 miles offshore? So I came and we had the first month traveling to it didn't take a month. It takes 1 day to get from Florida to the Bahamas, or a long day rather. But we stayed through and we went on to a place called Great Sail. And it was there we kind of discovered that we had a common interest in photography. It was absolutely idyllic. And as time progressed during that month, we ended up having to do some tricky kind of sailing work. We were dodging coral heads in a very tight area. And I was on deck and I was using hand signals trying to help him, steer the boat accordingly. And after a period of time, this bond kind of developed between us. And the main thing for me was when you live 24/7 in a 40-foot space,
Mhm.
there's nowhere to go. You've got to make things work between you. And even though we were very different people, he grew up in Los Angeles, I grew up in Ireland, different cultural backgrounds. We grew up in different decades. So it was interesting to try and see how we could make those things work. And we did. We found little ways, especially when things went wrong. Like we had a real problem one time docking. And we learned that both of us could view the exact same situation, but differently and experience it differently. So those kind of talks really, really drew us together.
Yeah, yeah. So, and I mean this in all respect, but that last part of the book is like this romance. It's almost like a Mills and Boone section part of it as well. It's just, but after all you've been through with what you've said the rest of the interview, what was it about? Obviously, you've got that intimate space as well, but I imagine you've been sailing with other people before. So, what other qualities was it about him that you thought, actually, I can really open up to this guy?
That's absolutely spot on. I could, and I didn't know at first why it was, but I had done a year as a platinum partner with Tony Robbins at one point where I was learning a lot about how to view life and how to look at the positive things and how to, really take stock of who you are and what you're about. And Gary had actually done a 2-year master's degree program in spiritual psychology. So his perception, if you like, on life and his outlook was really stimulating for me. And he started to ask me questions about stuff that I had buried in my past. For instance, we talked about the earlier childhood bit of trauma. And he started to ask me a little bit more about that. And I was saying, yeah, I got over it. It was fine. And he goes, well, how did you get over it? And I went, well, what do you mean? And he goes, well, did you go talk to a therapist? Did you go see somebody? And I went, no, you just got on with it. And he actually was the person who was able to equate periods of my life as to where, well, was that one of the reasons where, like, for instance, I was dieting an awful lot during my life. And I was putting on weight, and then as soon as I'd get within my goal weight, suddenly I would go back to fat. And he was saying, do you wonder if any of that has got to do with the childhood trauma of being molested as a child by a stranger? And as the time went by, I realized, well, maybe that was it. And he said, well, why? The one question really resonated with me. He said to me, why is it that when you got within target of your goal weight, why did you turn around and self-sabotage your way back? And I realized it was when people started to compliment me. They said, oh, you're looking great. And that was drawing attention to me. And so somewhere subconsciously, I didn't want unwanted attention. So apparently I was clothing myself in this kind of protective layer. And when we talked that through, and he basically gave me this system of self-forgiveness, of how do you go about forgiving yourself for things that either weren't your fault or maybe were, but you still learn how to forgive yourself. And one of the things he taught me was our perception of when things were wrong and we thought we were at fault In my case, he said, "You were a child." And I said, "Well, but yeah, but surely it was, no, you were a child." And so if you can kind of condition your brain into the truth is you were a child, you were not in control of the situation, and forgive yourself for what you thought was an untruth once you embrace the truth. And items like that we talked about, those were the levels of conversations we would have at night after dinner. And little by little by little, they really resonated with me. And I suddenly found myself becoming who I really was and who I was meant to be, and really stepping into my own skin, if you like. And that progressed and progressed, and then I was able to share some of my insights of life with him. So we met on a very profound level, if you like. But interestingly enough, he had been in a long-term marriage, and he'd been out for quite a few years. So he wasn't really interested in having a relationship. And I really wasn't looking for it either. I was getting to a place where I was absolutely okay by myself. And if the rest of my life I was by myself, that was going to be fine. And we brought the boat back to Florida after 4 months. He went back to California, and I actually stayed on the boat because I was waiting to go to a family reunion in Ireland. So I stayed on for a few weeks. And after a while, he came back and he said he was going to take the boat out, and we sailed up to New Jersey, and he ended up coming to Ireland with me. And one of the things I learned when he came back was he didn't want a relationship, but he wasn't ready to let me go, because he really wanted to be free and not committed, and not tied up in a relationship. And part of what we decided to do was just take it one day at a time and say, I like you pretty much. Let's see how this goes. And over time, I think it was like 4 years later, living on the boat, he proposed on the deck. And it was like, and today, we're happily married, and we're so grateful and feel so blessed for the universe conspiring to bring us together.
Well, so how long have you been married to each other?
We're together 8.5 years, and we're now married 4.5.
Oh, okay, okay, cool. And as you say, the way you talked there about peeling off layers was almost your trauma, a cocoon almost, that you almost found, as weird as this may sound, but as bad as it was, you almost found comfort in it in many respects. You got because you got so used to it. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think you just go, well, that was just one chapter of my life, and move on. And I think there's a balance that you can find between um embracing, areas of your past if it's affecting your present. If it's not, then what I don't like to do is dwell on negative stuff. I like to create myself, or my environment, in a more positive way. And I may have a more Pollyanna view of my life, or behave in that way, because I do believe that whatever you fill your head with, that'll become your experience.
Yeah.
And you can focus, and you can justify anything by talking your way into it or out of it. And for me, I have now done a lot of work on that in my own head, and go, I'm fine with it now. You know what I mean? It's resolved.
Hmm.
And there's another part actually in the memoir in Following Sunshine where I talk about grief for my mother. I did experience a lot of grief and went through it with my dad's death. But with my mother at the time, I kind of processed it intellectually, and I didn't process it emotionally. And believe it or not, it was down in Tonga where it came up like 18 months, I think it was about 18 months later. And I was really upset one day, and I didn't understand why. And it turned out that I hadn't actually processed the grief, the emotional side of it. And I think we have to go through those difficult periods in order to, like, really move forward.
So obviously you said before that your book ends with basically the start of your first book before this, with the two men meeting them on the island. But other than that, have you done any more sailing since the end of the book?
Yes, we sailed, we went back, we were off the water for a little bit during the pandemic because we actually had to haul the boat out and leave it in Antigua, right where we actually, not long after we met the two lads from Flares Up. And we were on land. And what was really weird was most people were having a difficulty living on top of each other. It was a difficult time for a lot of people, especially if they were trying to homeschool kids and, lost their job and are working from home. Excuse me. And for us, it was the opposite. We suddenly were in a house on land with doors and windows and everything else like that. So we had to get used to living more largely, if you like. So after that experience, and when we were able to go back to Antigua, we brought the boat back to Florida. We sailed her up from there, to St. Martin and then on to St. Bart's, which is where I met the guy who I'd originally volunteered for way back when, before I met Gary. So yeah, we sailed it back. But when we eventually brought her back to Florida, we sold the boat, and now we have a day boat. So we're still on the water, but we're not going through the tough stuff on the water anymore.
Oh, good, good. I was actually thinking while doing this interview, you traveled a lot around the world. Is there anywhere that you would like to visit that you haven't visited yet?
Yes, always. One of the places I would love to visit, obviously, is the Maldives because of the beautiful water. I kind of love that. We've been talking about maybe Japan, places that neither of us have been, because we've both been to a lot of countries, and we actually have a little competition going. Well, who's been to the most countries? And no, we're not going there because you've been or I've been, that kind of thing. But also at the moment now, we're guest speakers on celebrity cruises. So we are looking at that as our way of doing a combination of working and also visiting new places.
Oh, good. That's really good. So when you say celebrity speakers, was it you just go up there and speak about your lives or what? How does that particularly work?
So on the Celebrity Cruise Line, they have a program called Beyond the Podium, and they have three types of speakers come on board for that. One would be a destination speaker. In other words, tomorrow we're going to be visiting St. Martin's. Here's what you would expect in this port, or the Barbados, etc. Another one would be a naturalist who would be mostly on like the Galapagos cruises or Alaska, where they'll say, here's the animals you expect to see, here's the flora and fauna. And then the third category of speakers they have is authors, sports personalities, celebrities, and the talks are much more like entertainment value. So some of ours are we do one story on Flares Up, and showing the back behind the scenes of the two lads rowing across the ocean. Another one is of finding meaning through traveling, which is a lot of our volunteer projects that we both did around the world. Gary had some in Peru and in China, and then we do a story of actually what's it like to really live on a sailboat, not just the sail off into the sunset.
Uh,
And also I do some writers workshops as well. I do how to unleash the writer within you, and also how to write your memoir, do some talks like that.
okay, okay. And speaking of writing, what's next for you now? Because obviously two books in relatively quick succession. Are you gonna have you got plans for a third book? Like what's your next plans over the next 18 months?
Well, the next one that I have coming out is a book I've curated called Stories of Place. And about back in 2020, I founded this international writers group of people who had taken a Curtis Brown creative course there in the UK, all online. At the time, somebody was in Japan, Australia, England, Ireland, and also America. And at the end of that course, I brought everybody together and we meet monthly via Zoom. And after 3 years, I think we put together a retreat in the UK, and we all met in person for the first time. And some people were published and some people were not. So my goal was to try and get everybody a traditionally published, traditional publishing deal. So we started putting our stories together. So I've been curating that, and that's due out next May, from Black Rose Writing here in the in the US. So that'll come out on May 15th, and we're going to have a simultaneous launch. So every one of the 9 writers around the world will have the launch in their hometown on the right day.
Oh, cool. Well, Niamh, it's always been a pleasure talking to you. If people want to find out more about the book and where they can buy it, where can I go to?
Probably the best place to find me online, and I'm all on all the different social media platforms, but the best place to go to first of all would be my website, which is thewriteronthewater.com. So it's thewriteronthewater.com, exactly spelled exactly as it is. And there you'll find out much more information, a lot of my other writings and some magazine writings, etc. as well. But also all the links to all my social media on Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn and YouTube, all that good stuff.
Okay, cool. Niamh, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much again for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you, Chris. Love talking with you, and it's amazing. Congratulations on your podcast. We were together on, I think I was on episode 2 originally.
Yeah.
So it's very impressive that you've kept it going and you're really going from strength to strength. Congratulations.
Thank you for the kind words. Thank you.